Good morning, Open Door Ministries, and to all our friends and family on Facebook and YouTube. It is great to be back sharing the Word of God with all of you again today. Over the last couple of weeks, I've been answering some interesting questions that appear currently in our news. I talked about whether or not pastors should deny communion. I've been talking about women in ministry. These are all things being discussed within the churches across the United States. And of course, another sort of hot topic issue that's come up, and we'll see it kind of show up over and over again, is the issue of same-sex marriage. And the specific question that I want to look at is, can pastors be forced to perform a wedding? And the reason I picked this particular question is because I'm still on the mailing list for several very fundamentalist evangelical associations. They still send me fundraising letters. And, you know, one of the things I get every once in a while is that the government is overreaching itself, and pretty soon pastors are going to be forced to perform same-sex weddings in their churches. And if you don't, you're going to get arrested and thrown into jail. And when I read that, I'm kind of shocked by this sort of we could call it misinformation, disinformation. I think, unfortunately, that it's actually a lie. It's a purposeful lie to cause fear within people in an effort to raise funds. So I want to kind of take a look at this. Can pastors be forced to perform a wedding? I picked this headline out from Religious Freedom and Sexuality. They're answering this question: can pastors and churches be forced to perform same-sex marriages? This is from the Baptist Press: gay weddings, who must perform them? And again, the question is, you know, will we as Baptists be forced to do this? The AME, which is the African Methodist Episcopal Church, their general conference right now is debating on same-sex marriage, and it's going to continue. They formed a special committee, and they had a bill that was up for their denomination, but yet it was voted down. But again, this is an issue that is reoccurring. So let's kind of take a look at it. Can clergy be forced to officiate not just a same-sex wedding, but any wedding? And the short answer is simply no. You can't force clergy to perform or officiate at a wedding. And I need to add some sort of caveats and a few other things here for you. Let's give a few examples. Let's suppose that I, as a clergy member, have decided that I do not want to perform any marriage ceremonies. I will not officiate at a wedding if the couples have been previously divorced. As long as I am consistent in that, as long as that is my religious belief, the government cannot interfere with that. There's just no way that they can do it. Clergy have a certain amount of independence. We have this definite separation where the government will not involve themselves in telling me what I can and cannot do. And the same issue stands for same-sex marriages, that if I decline to do one because of my religious beliefs, nobody can force me to do that. The government will not and cannot come into a church and say, you have to do this. And when you hear somebody say this, it's not true. It has never happened, and it will not happen. It's a fear tactic oftentimes used for fundraising or to get people all riled up to get them to do some kind of actions, either to go out and vote or to send in that check. Now, oftentimes people say to me, but I heard, and there are some stories out there that you'll hear, for example, that the church was sued for not allowing a lesbian couple to get married. And that, of course, is misinformation. That is distorted information. And unfortunately, I think the group that put out this story was literally lying about it. It was an intentional lie to get people angry and get them riled up and of course, make that contribution to supposedly fight this. What actually happened, and this is the actual headline from it, that a North Carolina wedding venue, notice it's a wedding venue, not a church. It's a wedding venue denies lesbian couples, citing Christian values. An employee told the brides-to-be that the Winston-Salem event space does not host same-sex marriage ceremonies. There is a big difference between an event space, a wedding venue, and a church. And so this was not a church. The employees were not pastors. These were individuals who were doing were running a business, providing space to hold events, and they were not clergy. And so anybody who tells you, well, a church was sued, that's not what happened at all. That is either a misunderstanding of what happened or it's a deliberate lie. We really need to kind of get into the idea of the differences between churches versus businesses. Churches can deny a wedding venue. Here at Open Door Ministry, we have a space. If we didn't want to hold weddings here, we can say no weddings here. I could exclude people from holding weddings here. I could say, I'm sorry, only members of this church can have weddings here. Or I could say, oh, I'm sorry, only people who have never been divorced can have weddings here. But I need to be consistent in that policy. I'm a church. The government is not going to interfere in what I do here. However, businesses are very different. Businesses have different rules. Again, when we talk about churches, I think possibly the best example of a church being able to exclude people from having their weddings there, think of Catholic churches. Protestants cannot marry within the Catholic Church. If you were a Protestant and you found a nice Catholic church and you say, I like the stained glass, I like this, I like that, I'd like to get married here, the administrators would tell you, I'm sorry, you have to take classes and convert to Catholicism in order to get married in this church. It's the right of the church. Businesses, however, cannot do this because businesses have to provide public access. They serve the entire public. So for example, in the North Carolina wedding venue, and they were citing their Christian values, the courts ruled against them because they oftentimes rent that space to people who are not Christians. They rent that space to people who are having other events other than weddings, that the property was not set aside exclusively for Christian weddings. And so by doing this, they were discriminating. Sometimes we have to be very careful, and there have been some cases where we've had to make some decisions because we mix church and business together, and it's very difficult, and it becomes very tricky when you begin mixing churches and businesses. And oftentimes when I talk about this topic with other pastors, I always tell them, be very careful about who you rent out church space to. So for example, church is renting out, say, a space because somebody wants to hold just a party there. That makes it now a business, that they are earning income and they are using this space for non-religious purposes. I know some churches that are very large. They will rent out their large auditoriums for concerts. Somebody wants to rent it for a concert. Some people, especially smaller high schools, will rent large auditorium churches for their graduation ceremonies. But see, once you start renting out the space of the church for purposes other than religious purposes, you've moved into, I'm kind of a business thing going on here. Weddings for non-members, churches used for non-religious purposes like high school graduations, or even pastors who perform weddings for non-members, these all become kind of gray areas. If the pastor's got a little side hustle going on, doing weddings for other non-members of the church, then the question is, are they functioning as clergy, as a representative of their particular church, their particular denomination, or are they actually running a business, a wedding officiant business? And so it can get very tricky there. And yes, now charges of discrimination can come up, because if you're doing weddings for other people outside of your church, no longer are you functioning as clergy for your church, but now you're functioning as sort of a public servant. Should clergy officiate same-sex weddings? And that's really the question that's going on here. Not, can clergy be forced? There's no way a clergy member can be forced to perform a same-sex wedding. But then we come to the very tricky area. Should they do it? Should they perform same-sex weddings? And when I now jump into this topic, trust me, there are going to be people angry with me on both sides of this issue. So I think it's going to be a really great sermon because I'm going to offend everybody. I think that's what a really good sermon should do. It should get everybody sort of thinking about why I'm possibly wrong. But anyway, again, this is just sort of my personal take on this. This is where I'm at in my spiritual journey. This is where I'm at as I have studied this issue. And so I'm sharing that with you, and I hope that you engage both the Bible and yourself as you look at this issue. So, should clergy officiate same-sex weddings? And I'm going to say it depends. It really depends. And that's going to bother some people because it's like, well, if he's saying yes, well, let me give you all these reasons why he's wrong. And if he says no, let me give you all these reasons why you're wrong. But I say it kind of depends, and here's what it depends on. What is your denomination's stance? What does the denomination that has ordained you say? So, for example, there are some denominations right now, like the AME or the Anglican Church or some of the other churches who are like, no, we don't do same-sex marriages. And if that is the organization that you have chosen to join, if that is the rules that are imposed upon you, if those are the rules you have agreed to follow, if you have agreed to place yourself under the authority of that denomination, then you should abide by your agreement. However, if you find that you cannot and that you disagree, you have two choices. You can either work to have that particular policy changed, or you can leave that denomination. But if your denominational stance is that you should not do same-sex marriages, then I think you shouldn't do them. Either work to change the policy or leave the denomination. What is the clergy member's stance is the other depends. What does that clergy member actually believe for themselves? If they believe it's wrong, then they shouldn't do it. Oh, but what if they are in a denomination that says they do allow same-sex marriages? Again, either work to change the policy or leave that denomination. If you as a clergy person do not believe in performing same-sex marriages and yet your denomination does, you should really leave that denomination and find one that lines up with you. I don't think that you should be acting out against your denominational stance, either refusing or doing them if your denomination disagrees with it. I think that you either work to change it or that you change denominations. All right, so when we talk about denominational stance, understand this. There are over 800, more than 800 mainstream and progressive denominations that fully affirm LGBTQ plus people, which includes they allow LGBTQ plus membership, ordination, and marriage. And so if you are in a denomination as a pastor and you think that you disagree with your denomination stance, there are over 800 different denominations that you can join that will allow you to do this. Most evangelical and fundamentalist churches do not allow full, complete affirmation and inclusion of the LGBTQ membership. So if you are a fundamentalist or an evangelical and you come to the point in your life where you decide this is something that I disagree with my denomination's stance, well, then you may need to go into a more mainstream or progressive denomination. If an LGBT person asked my advice, let's say they were in a denomination that is not fully affirming, that doesn't allow same-sex marriage, if they came to me and they asked my advice, I would probably send them to an affirming denomination. I'd say, it's time for you to leave. It's time for you to be active. If you want to be an activist, if you want to vote with your feet, then you should stand up and leave and go find another denomination. Because that denomination is dependent upon the attendance and the giving and people actually being there. That is why we are seeing so many denominations shrink and die, because people have simply left. People are voting with their feet. And so if an LGBTQ person came to me and said, I'm in this denomination, it does not fully affirm me, they won't allow me to be a member, they won't allow me to serve, I can't get ordained there, I can't get married there, what do you think I should do? I'd say, well, you need to leave. There's 800 other denominations to choose from. So you should probably move on to someplace else. If a clergy person disagreed with their denomination, I'd advise them to change. Whether you're for or against, if you disagree with your denomination, if you can't find yourself under the authority of that, then change. Go someplace else. You can always serve someplace else. Here in the United States, we are crazy when it comes to denomination. We have something like 27,000 different denominations here in the United States, plus non-denominational churches that don't answer to a particular church hierarchy structure. And so it's easy to find a place to minister if you disagree with what your denomination is teaching. So I would, if a clergy person came to me and said, I disagree with my denomination, I'd say, well, then change. If you can no longer affirm what your denomination stands for, you need to change. Well, what about clergy stance? What do I think about clergy? What do I think should be going on? I think that clergy need to be brave and openly take a stance on whatever it is that they believed. You know, every week I stand up here and I share with you my spiritual journey. I share with you the process that I'm going through as I continue to live out my Christian life, based upon what I study, based upon the interactions that I have with other fellow Christians that I trust very much. I share that with you. I openly take my stance and I say, this is what I believe. And of course, sometimes some people very strongly disagree with me. I've been called a blasphemer and a heretic and a false teacher and everything else that you can imagine. And there are some people who strongly agree with me, and there are some people who are somewhere in the middle. They're like, well, I don't know, it's reasonable. I don't like it, but it's reasonable. I can understand why you believe that. And so there are people who react to my stances all the time in different ways, and I'm okay with that. But I think clergy need to be brave enough to take that stand. I believe our number one job is to take a stand and share what they believe, what their spiritual journey is. I think there are too many clergy who are hiding behind pulpits and not saying what they actually believe. I cannot tell you how many ministers I know who are in evangelical and fundamentalist churches, and they don't believe in the inerrancy of the Bible, and yet they preach it. They don't believe in some of the things that their denomination believes in, and yet they preach it and teach it because they would lose their job if they didn't. I think they need to bravely come out, take a stand, say, this is where I'm at, this is why, and then follow through on the consequences. If their denomination fires them, so be it, or if they need to move on, so be it. But it's time for clergy to stop being cowards and just towing the party line when they need to take a stand on these issues. Clergy need to be consistent in their stance. And this particularly comes up for me when I hear clergy say, well, I can't do a same-sex marriage because of the sanctity of marriage. You know, I'm like, I find a hard time believing that. You yourself were divorced and remarried. You're marrying people who were divorced and are now remarrying. You don't ask other people. You don't ask couples about whether or not they were sleeping together before they were married. You don't ask about, what's going on between. You don't. As long as it's a man and a woman standing in front of you, you'll do it. But there's a lot of reasons in the Bible that says they shouldn't get married. And yet you don't ask about that. You only take a stance against this marriage when you can obviously see on the surface level that it's two people of the same sex. But you don't ever question what's going on with people who are of opposite sex. And I know some pastors who have married some people that never should have been married. And if they had done due diligence, they would not have performed the ceremony. I think clergy need to be consistent. That if they are going to treat marriage as something very sacred, then they need to make sure that they are doing their due diligence for everybody. Again, that sanctity of marriage argument, I got to tell you, I get really, really tired of hearing some of these pompous blowhards who are commentators and influencers and things like that, who are on their third or fourth marriage and they're screaming sanctity of marriage. And it's like, go home and sanctify your own marriage and leave other people alone. You have no right to speak on this topic. Okay? And again, I want to talk about the officiating side hustle. There are a lot of pastors who found that they can pick up some quick and easy dollars by officiating marriages, outside of their own church. They belong to like some kind of service that will send them out to officiate weddings in homes and in backyards and in other venues. And oftentimes they kind of do this little side hustle. And my question is, do you know anything about these people? Oftentimes you simply walk in, you officiate the wedding, and that's it. You don't know anything about their lives. You don't know why they're getting married. You don't know if this is their 14th marriage or what. And so if you're saying sanctity of marriage when it comes to, same-sex couples getting married, you need to give up your little side hustle because you're not being consistent. You're being hypocritical. All right, with all that said, what about Open Door Ministries? Here we are, Open Door Ministries. What does our particular church believe? What do we believe as a church? And I can pretty much say that ODM is fully inclusive of all people. ODM is fully inclusive of all people, and that includes LGBTQ plus people. We are fully inclusive and affirming of them. But when I say fully inclusive of all people, I'm also talking about people who may have doctrinal differences between each other. We have some people here, they're, premillennial dispensationalists. We have some people here who are amillennialists. We have some people who don't follow dispensationalism at all. We have people here who are universalists. We have people here who believe in annihilism. We have people who believe in eternal conscious torment in hell forever and ever. We have people whose doctrinal beliefs are kind of all over the map. And we fully affirm them. You don't have to believe the way I believe to be a member of this church. You don't have to believe the same way that everybody else in the churches believes to become a member. There is one key thing, though. We are a Jesus-centric church. We unify around Jesus. It's all about Jesus. Jesus, 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 all the time. We believe that Jesus is the ultimate revelation of who God is, and that Jesus is the ultimate revelation of how to live our human lives. And so we focus on him. Jesus-centric. As long as you're Jesus-centric like we are, we can argue about all these other points. We can discuss them. We can hold disagreeing viewpoints. We can hold different political opinions. But we will unify around Christ. So we are fully inclusive of all people. Can women become pastors? Yes. Can they be deacons and elders? Yes. We believe very much. There's no slave, there's no free, there's no Jew, there's no Greek, there's no male, there's no female, and we are fully inclusive of the LGBTQ community. ODM affirms same-sex marriages. We affirm those marriages. Whether you had a civil marriage at the courthouse or you want to get married within our church, we will perform the ceremony for you. We fully affirm. By the way, we don't call them same-sex marriages, we just call them marriages. Because even by merely calling them same-sex marriages, it's as though there were some kind of distinction between that and just regular old marriage. And so we don't call them same-sex marriages, we just call them marriages. You want to get married? We'll marry you. Not a problem. What is my stance as clergy? What's my stance as a pastor? And again, I'm sharing with you my own spiritual journey, where I've come from. And I'm sure anybody who's watched this channel or been in ODM for a long time, I was raised, right, a fundamentalist and evangelical. I'm a former fundie, right? I'm an ex-evangelical. Okay, I used to be a fundagelical. I'm not anymore, right? I left fundamentalism. And as I oftentimes say, I took the fun and left them with the mental. I'm an ex-evangelical because I can no longer agree with the policies that are going on within that church. And I can't agree with many of the things that they are teaching nowadays. That's why oftentimes I tend to be sort of a critique. I tend to critique what they're doing. I'm not trying to beat them up. I'm not trying to be rude, but I will definitely critique and call them out where I believe they're wrong. And I know they do the same to me. My particular stance, I look at the Bible verses that are used to discriminate against LGBTQ plus people, and I see that many of them are used out of context. Context is everything. That what we read into those verses here in the 21st century is not how the audience who originally received those verses would have understood them. We take them out of the cultural context and out of their historical context, and we read into those scriptures our own particular 20th and 21st century interpretations. And I can also point out to you that there are some very dubious translations of the Hebrew and Greek words. That there have been some translation issues where we have deliberately mistranslated certain words within the Bible. And in fact, I will recommend to you, there are some great resources out there you can look at. There's a documentary coming up called 1946 that will explain how the word homosexual got into the Bible. It wasn't there. It doesn't belong there. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about Hebrew, Greek, or Latin. There is no word for homosexuality in any of those languages. And so to put that word in the Bible, it doesn't belong there. So I encourage you to watch 1946. I'll ask Deborah to put a link to it for you. There's many great resources and books. I'll have Deborah link some of those for you. She's very up to date on those, and she'll put some of those down there in the links for you. But I believe there's enough evidence. There is enough evidence that reasonably I can say this is a very questionable stance to take as a Christian, to be anti-LGBTQ. Again, over 800 denominations and myself have chosen grace over legalism. Almost every verse you're going to find in the Bible is taken in a very legalistic way and applied in a way that puts heavy burdens on people for sins that they're not committing. And so myself and 800 other denominations, we have decided that since this is so dubious and questionable, that we will err on the side of grace rather than to force legalism upon people. I see here in this country that marriage as a civil right should not be legally denied. That marriage as a civil right should not be legally denied. Here in the United States, right, we practice marriage differently. Not only is it a civil institution, it's also a religious institution. You can go down to the courthouse, you can get married and have no mention of God, no clergy people involved whatsoever. It's a civil institution. You are issued a license to be married. And so as a civil right, it is wrong constitutionally, legally, to deny anybody that right. And to deny them that right is oppression. To deny them that right is discrimination. There's no two ways about that. As clergy, I believe officiating a religious marriage fulfills my debt of love. Officiating a religious marriage, even if it is for a same-sex couple, fulfills my debt of love. And let me explain this for you. If you look in Romans, there's a verse that reads this way: let no debt remain outstanding except, this is the only debt that I should have, except the continuing debt to love one another. For whoever loves others has fulfilled the law. Let me say that again. Whoever loves others has fulfilled the law. The commandments: you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet. And whatever other command there may be. Catch that one. Whatever other command there may be are summed up in this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. Romans 13:8-10. Love does no harm to a neighbor. And if you want to know who is your neighbor, just look up my teachings on the Good Samaritan. It answers the question, who is my neighbor? Love does no harm to a neighbor. Now, there have been all kinds of research done on marriage and its effect on people. And over again, it's been demonstrated that marriage provides physical and mental health benefits. That you have less stress in your life if you're married. That you will actually live longer if you're married. That you have better mental health. That you are not as depressed or anxious if you are married. So marriage is very beneficial to human beings. It provides physical and mental health benefits. They live longer and happier lives. So if I deny somebody marriage, if I deny them the right to be married, I am denying them longer lives. I am denying them happier lives. I am hurting their physical health, and I am hurting their mental health. And yet love does not hurt your neighbor. So I am acting in an unloving way. By civil rights principles, I should not deny it. By my religious orientation, I should say, I'm loving them by providing them the ability to have longer and happier lives. It's just that simple. For the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command. Love your neighbor as yourself. That's Galatians 5:14. Love your neighbor as yourself. I sometimes wonder what would happen if I went to some of the couples that I know are married and have been multiply married, if I were to suddenly take away their right to ever get married again. If I were to say to you, you can't get married again. Well, why? Well, you're already married. You were married before. And even though you went through a legal divorce in the eyes of God, you're still married. And to marry somebody else would mean that you're living in adultery. You know what they would do? They would change churches. They would go find somebody to go marry them. Or they would get a civil marriage. See, Christians are highly inconsistent about this. When you look at evangelical Christians and the fact that they have a divorce rate equal to non-Christians and a remarriage rate almost exactly the same, they're being very hypocritical about this. We need to love our neighbor as ourselves, and we're not doing that. In the full affirmation of LGBTQ plus rights and the offering of full participation of the LGBTQ plus community in the life of the church, I avoid doing harm and actively demonstrate love for my neighbor. Yes, but I thought they were our enemies. Well, no problem. If you don't want to call them your neighbor, if you consider them enemies, guess what? Love your enemies, Christ commanded us. That we are under an obligation, we are under a debt of love. If you have the ability to give somebody a longer, healthier, happier life, why wouldn't you do it? Will you allow a doctrinal stance to prevent you from showing love? Will you allow a doctrinal stance to harm someone else? That doesn't make sense to me. Because any time that we find ourselves in that kind of dilemma, a choice between doctrine and loving people, doctrine loses. Doctrine is of men. Love is of God. What about the sanctity of marriage, you might ask? Well, what about it? Well, here's what I got to say about the sanctity of marriage. Your marriage is only as sacred as you hold it in your heart. You know what? What this other couple does down the street has no impact on my marriage. Who knows what they're into? Are you trying to tell me that an abusive relationship, a man and wife who are embroiled in domestic abuse, that they, just because they are male and female, are making marriage sacred? I say they are destroying their marriage vows. I say they are ruining the institution of marriage, that their marriage is not sacred because the husband is not loving the wife like Christ loves the church. If you really are so concerned about the sanctity of marriage, why aren't we dealing with domestic abuse? Why is it pastors send wives back to their husbands who are abusive and tell them, submit? That's destroying the sanctity of marriage right there. Not the fact that two guys got married or two women got married. I have seen LGBTQ plus couples who have been married longer and are more faithful than some of my evangelical counterparts. When they're celebrating 20 years of marriage and 25 years of marriage, and one of my evangelical counterparts that I went to high school with is on their third marriage and is cheating on his wife right now, which one? Which one is sanctifying marriage within their hearts? Which one? I'll go with that same-sex couple every time. The sanctity of marriage has nothing to do with what kind of genitalia is between your legs. It has to do with what's going on within your heart. Are you sanctifying your marriage before God? Yes or no? Because I see an awful lot of unsanctified marriages being practiced in the church today. All right. So now you know my denomination stance. Now you know my particular stance. You know why I believe that we have an obligation, a debt to show love and to actually help and love same-sex couples in this marriage, to give them longer, happier, healthier lives. How do we act this out? What should we do as Christians? And these are my suggestions for you. Number one, stop spreading lies. Stop spreading lies. We need to stop with the fake lies about, oh, the government's going to come in like stormtroopers in your church and they're going to make you, marry somebody of the same sex or force clergy to marry people of the same sex. The government's never going to do that. If you hear that, that's just fear to manipulate you. Stop listening to those lies and stop spreading those lies. Because lies in the name of God are still lies. The ends do not justify the means. I encourage you, be an active participant in your spiritual education, not just a passive believer. Every once in a while, you need to start questioning your beliefs. For many of us who were raised in the church, I was raised in the church, I grew up in the church, I was taught certain things. And for me to go back and to change those things, to reconsider, to question what I was taught as a child is painful. And it's difficult. And I get anxious and I get fearful about it sometimes. But I can tell you over and over again what I have experienced is I find a mountain of scriptural evidence that says this is what Jesus taught. This is what your master calls you to do, and it's in conflict with what you learned when you were 5 or 6 years old sitting in Sunday school. And I've had to drop those, and it's difficult and it's hard. But you need to be an active participant in your spiritual education. If you just believe whatever pastor tells you, you're not being active. You need to question and make sure that you are following Christ and answering that obligation of love. Ask yourself, what is the fruit of this teaching? What is the fruit of this teaching? Suppose somebody tells you a doctrine like, same-sex marriage destroys the sanctity of marriage. Well, what's the fruit of that? Are you fearful? Are you anxious? Are you angry? Does it allow you to lash out against people you don't like? Does it allow you to discriminate and that makes you happy? Because now you can put those people in their place? Then that's bad fruit. Because the fruit of the Spirit is not anger and anxiousness and fear. It's not discrimination. That's not the fruit of the Spirit. So when a teaching comes in, it should bring life. Doctrine should be bringing us life and joy. It should prompt us towards love of our neighbor. And if that is not what this teaching is producing within you, then it's a wrong teaching. You should ask yourself this very important question. If I can do something to make life better for another person, even my enemy, shouldn't I do it to show love? Love one another. Love your neighbor. Love your enemy. If I can do something to make their life better, shouldn't I do it so that I can show love? If allowing same-sex couples to get married makes them happier, healthier, both physically and mentally, shouldn't we step back and stop discriminating against them? Ask yourself that. All right, so I know that I've thrown out my personal opinion about this matter, and some of you will agree with it, and some of you will disagree with it. Let us know your thoughts. I'd like to know your thoughts. I know this is a sort of hot-button issue, just like denying communion, just like women in ministry. Let us know your thoughts. Let's discuss it. Let's find out what people are thinking. Let us know your views on churches and marriage. I would love to engage with you on these topics. Leave a comment down below. Also, if you got something from this particular sermon, please like it, share it, ring the little bell so you know when we put up new sermons and things like that. But until then, why don't you join me in prayer, please? Heavenly Father, we come before you. The most important thing that we can do, as Jesus taught us, the two greatest commandments, to love the Lord our God with all our hearts and all our souls and all our minds, and to love our neighbor. Father, have we used doctrine? Have we used doctrine to circumvent that command? Show us, O Lord. Show us, O Lord, if we have misused doctrine so that we do not have to do the very hard and difficult job of loving our neighbor. Father, I know that this is a controversial issue for some people, but I give praise and I give thanks for those over 800 denominations who have chosen love and who have chosen grace. I pray for my brothers and sisters, my neighbors who are LGBTQ. Father, let them know that not all churches are the same, that not all Christians are alike, that they are loved and they are affirmed, and many, many denominations, Lord, many denominations will love and affirm them and accept them. They will be allowed to not only attend, but to be members, to serve, to be ordained, to be married, that they are loved by you. Every act of ministry we do reveals something about you. And I just pray, Lord, for myself personally, as clergy, as a minister, that my ministry will communicate your great grace. My ministry will communicate your great love. My ministry will communicate that you are on our side, that you are for us and not against us. Father, we thank you for Jesus, the revelation, who taught us over and over again and commanded us over and over again, love one another, love your neighbor, love your enemy. Father, I pray for us as we prepare to reopen the church, to allow people to attend again. I know there are people who are anxious. There's just a lot of generalized anxiety out there about coming out of our isolation. What's going to happen? Is it safe? Father, I just pray that you'll send the Holy Spirit to help us deal with that anxiety. Lord, help people know that we take their safety and their health very seriously, and that we will provide the safest environment we possibly can. Help everyone to conform to the rules that must be conformed to as an obligation, as paying off that debt of love, to look out for one another and to take care of one another. We just pray all of these things in your name. Amen. Well, that's a wrap for this week. And until next week, may you go in peace and may God bless you.